Hey everybody, this is James P. Wagner here again with Nick Hale. Hey Nick,
Hi, James. Hi, everybody.
and this is the Publisher's Speakeasy, which is the behind the scenes, don't tell anybody, where we talk about poetry and publishing topics, usually frequently asked questions, things that you've sent in, maybe questions that people have asked in our seminars. Started from a conversation we were having at a live event where we were like, why don't we make videos answering these questions so we don't have to, answer them a million times, but we do anyway, but for those who don't get to ask us, in person. So today's question is an interesting one, and it actually recently came up in a seminar that we were actually teaching, and that's how many poems should you have published before you decide to publish a poetry collection? And that's an interesting question that it's not the first time we've actually heard it, and it's one that has very kind of compartmentalized answers because there really is no one exact answer on that. You want to kind of kick that off, Nick? Or...
Yeah, I know we're going to start off by giving you the answer that we give to basically every question. It drives people crazy. It depends. But I like, I think I think it's not the kind of thing, to me, it doesn't matter as much as it does to some people. Like, I think that depending on like the poetry, if you have lots of stuff written already, you could probably, even if you've never been published, get away with putting together a collection. Part of it depends on what you want to do with that collection. Like
Mhm.
if you're expecting to become a bestseller, it sure as heck helps if your poems have been published somewhere else first.
Mhm.
But if you just want to get it in print just to see it in print, then that's a different story. On the other hand, I think there is a point where you get to be too much. Like if every single poem in your book is published somewhere else, then I guess what's the point of the book?
Yeah, I mean, some musicians kind of have that problem where they, have every single thing in an album up there for free somewhere, like either a music video or something like that. And then it's like, well, why buy the album at that point? Um, but yeah, I think that there's a little bit of a some holdover philosophy of maybe how things were 20, 30 years ago, like, probably more from the academic side of things, where it was like, the whole publisher perish thing, and they're looking specifically for like peer reviewed publishers. And so if you're coming out with a book, they might have had an expectation of you must be published X number of times, in X number of, very sophisticated journals or magazines before we consider taking on your book. And, when it comes to publishing, I mean, obviously having previous, poems previously published certainly doesn't hurt you, because it shows publishers that, like, yeah, somebody actually took a chance on your work, and somebody, some level of peer review has happened where somebody looked this at, I like this, I'm going to put this out there. It shows them that you're serious as a writer and all that stuff. So a lot of good things, from having a bunch of poems previously published. But unless you're going for like a high end, maybe academic press or something with like a lot of prestige and lots of rejections, it's not necessarily there's not really necessarily a number that you're shooting for in terms of that. I mean, some publishers, out there, they may really just like your work based on its topic, its subject matter. Maybe you're, a poet who's completely been a performance poet up to that point. Maybe you have a really big audience already established who just like to hear your stuff. And so you're coming out with a book for the first time. Maybe you've never actually had it in print, but you've already got the audience. And so, a publisher is not going to necessarily care. On the other side of things, though, it's like, yeah, if you, you do have a list of publications, obviously let the publisher know. And, like, so I think the rough answer that we gave the person in the seminar was that, maybe, somewhere between 6 to 8, 8 to 10 might be like, if you're like going for a personal goal, if you want to have this, many poems published before a book, like that might be in the range that you would shoot for. That's pretty good. But there's really no magical number that like once you unlock this number, you get the experience points. It's going to up you a level to, do that kind of like a video game or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of a way of proving you're worthy, right? So to speak. Like if some other publishers have signed off on your poem, so to, in a way, it's like you have that approval. So it tells the other publishers, well, hey, this person's stuff is not terrible. But it also like where it's been published depends. You kind of hit on that a little bit when you're talking about like
Yeah.
if a journal has prestige or a publication has prestige. It reminds me of a poem from when when I was living in the Dallas Fort Worth area and I was going to the Dallas Community Poets Workshop. A friend of mine brought in this poem that was great. And it was all about these people celebrating, and the last line was something like he'd finally been published in his best friend's journal. So like, yeah, if all of your publications and maybe I'm a bit hypocritical with how many times I've been published in local gems publications, but I have been published elsewhere. If all of your publications have been in, a local journal that you and your friends started, or if you've been published in, like your high school art lit mag 15,000 times, um, and that's all you have, that's going to do you fewer favors than if you've been sort of out in the world and getting to know publishers. Because another side advantage of having been published before is that you start to build those relationships with the publishers. And James and I like to talk about this all the time. Um, the publishing it's about matchmaking. It's about building a relationship with the publisher, because you're not just a customer doing a transaction. And so the more you already know the publishers and the more you've proven that you're work withable, the better chance you'll have of getting published.
Yeah. And like I think we're also talking about this like so far mostly from the point of view of like you're going to be submitting the book to a traditional publisher and what they're going to think. And I think, maybe, get a little bit into the idea of like if you're going to be self-publishing the book yourself, like how many poems you might want to have previously published somewhere before that, because that would be kind of a whole different take on it too. And obviously, what you think is, like what your personal philosophy is would kind of matter there, because maybe it's like you're good with self-publishing the book, but you want to make sure that all the poems in there have sort of gotten somebody else's approval, by via some kind of publication at another point or whatever. Or maybe it's just a matter of you're using publication to kind of build up an audience and credits so that people will take the self-published book seriously, because there's still like there's still kind of the stigma in some cases about self-published books, where some people still think, I mean, it's a lot less than it used to be in the latter part of the 20th century, but some people still think, oh, self-published, what good is that? And they don't realize like, yeah, like how many famous, like canonical, books that, we cherish were originally self-published, and it's like, again, it's not like, a matter of, I mean, there's plenty of published books out there that are utter crap, so, and nobody, people think that, oh, it's published traditionally, that must mean it's good. Like, there's definitely a better chance of it being good when people are, kind of have an expertise in the field of how to get it out there than it is. I like to make the comparison, the deli sandwich versus the homemade sandwich. It's like nobody's gonna, people might argue that the deli sandwich is better, but nobody's gonna say that the sandwich you make at home is not a real sandwich.
Depends how much deli you go to.
Well, that's also true too. A lot of this depends on a lot of things, but from that point of view, it definitely, if you're looking to build the audience and to kind of give it some, sort of credential it, so to speak, 6 to 10 poems previously published, that are in the book, because then, in the book you could have an acknowledgments page, or maybe, just at the bottom of the poem list, like previously published in, stuff like that. And so if somebody flipping through it, they might be like, oh, okay, so that, this is a serious writer. They've been at this for a while. They've been published before, and then, maybe they're less likely to kind of, hello, water bottle. Maybe they're less likely to kind of judge the, the idea that, oh, it's self-published. What do I care about that for? Knowing that there's like some seriousness there, but also building an audience so that when the book is out, you actually, have people who are kind of waiting for it, and publishing a bunch of poems in that regard would definitely help with that. And then there's the benefit of, if a bunch of these poems have been previously published, that means they've definitely been refined poems that you've worked on, you've workshopped them, people have seen them. And then that's kind of just like a method of quality control, more than anything else too.
Yeah, I think the important part is that people have seen them part, because there's the other added side effect of the fact that your poems have been out there and have been exposed means that your chances of selling the book go up. Because yeah, it's sort of a double-edged sword. And that's why I think there's sort of a sweet spot where if you have more than half of the poems in your book already published, then you're doing yourself a disservice. But if you have some stuff out there and people have read it and liked it, they're more likely to want to buy your book. Whereas if nobody's ever heard of you, nobody's ever read your poems, and they don't know you personally, and they don't care, the chances of you selling your book are really low. So a big part of actually getting that book sold is getting your stuff out there, and it sort of marketing yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I can sure speak from experience on that, because when I was in high school, I had the bright idea to, self-publish a bunch of kind of really crappy small poetry collections, and Nick here still has some of them. Well, back
If
at his
anyone's
parents' house, still
interested.
have. Yeah, yeah, no, like no, yeah. There's even ones still left in my high school library, because I stupidly gifted a copy to the librarian who I was friends with, and he put it in circulation for some reason. you know, I
Yeah, so
established a scholarship to try to go back and sneak that book out of there, but every time I'm there to give the scholarship, the library is locked. But no, I self-published a bunch of crappy poetry books when I was in high school, and I probably sold maybe 4 or 5 of each, because there was like, who cared at that point? Mostly, I gave most of them away to friends, and blackmailers, like Nick over here, and family. So yeah, it wasn't until much later when I had obviously, started going to poetry readings on the regular, and like becoming the poetry examiner and all that stuff, and kind of building the following, did I start publishing books. Although, to be fair, the books were also better by that point, because in high school, very, very iffy on them. I mean, maybe I had 1 or 2 good ones, but the books were not that good. But so, yeah, obviously building the following later on, and then the book started selling, much better in that regard. So there's that element to it too. But from also a point of kind of like the mechanics of the whole thing, I've seen a lot of poets who they sort of use the whole, publishing individual poems in a collection they're going to come out with, kind of like as, stepping stones, in a way where it's like, they get themselves to a milestone, like, okay, I'm going to do this many poems, and then they're going to be published in these or whatever. And so it kind of, doing it piecemeal in some ways is just like a methodology, because obviously it's easier to write a few poems at a time, get them published, and have that, than it is to write a whole book in, a short span in some cases. I mean, some people do it, with, challenges or things like that, or just really hit with inspiration. Other people kind of space it out. So in some cases, just doing it that way is just, merely a, methodology of how to actually go about completing the whole thing. So,
yeah, it's sort of like serialized novels, right? You
yeah.
come out with them in pieces, and then eventually you realize, wow, I have enough pieces to make a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I mean that was like, getting back to like some of the famous books that have been self-published, like Charles Dickens. A lot of people don't realize that, a lot of his work originally, at least in book form, was self-published, because he got a big following because he was doing all these, short stories and chapters of novels serialized in a lot of magazines that were around back then. And so a lot of people had read him, but so when it came time, he basically gathered them all up, put them into books, and he paid himself to get them all printed, and then made deals with the bookshops, and then they started selling. But no, at least in, for a fair portion of it there, no traditional publisher actually took him on to do a whole length book. He did that himself to start off with. And now, speaking as a bookstore owner, I could say, when it comes to antiquarian and vintage sets, Charles Dickens, there's a lot of them, and they always sell too, because everybody knows the name, and also the books look nice on the mantle. But yeah, so there's that, there's, and then that's also why he was so verbose, because when writing in the magazines, he was getting paid by the word, which a lot of people, I remember like the college professors talking about, the detailed descriptions and the verbose language of Dickens, and I'm like, he was getting paid by the word, people, like, come on, like, yeah.
that's
But
funny because I remember in high school that was a thing that went around, was, oh, he was paid by the word, that's why this is so long. That
yeah.
was the thing. Is which book was it? It's gonna bother me, but it doesn't matter. It was the title's escaping me, but the book that we read in my freshman year of high school, and everybody was like cursing how long it was, and then it came out that he was paid by the word. It's like, oh, that explains it. This guy is. They're like, hey, he's not a good writer. He just wrote like that because he was getting paid more.
Yeah. But you have a lot of cases where you had people who they may have been, short story writers or serialized in magazines, and then they gathered up all their stuff into self-published collections. I mean, Walt Whitman Leaves of Grass was self-published and revised 17 times, but that was self-published. So that isn't necessarily a good or bad thing. The finished product and what happens with it is the determination of whether it was a good or bad thing, essentially. So um
Yeah,
but
I
yeah.
mean, to use a more modern example, 50 Shades of Grey was self-published at first. And I'm not to speak to the literary quality of the book, but that thing made money.
Yeah, it did.
So self-publishing does not necessarily mean that if something is self-published, it's not like it's going to be a curse on your book, and it's going to shoot your career in the foot, because yeah, it really does depend on not just the quality of the book either, but how the book is positioned. Like getting it in front of the right people, matching it with the people who are going to want it, is going to go a long way towards getting the book sold, which is really what you want at the end of the day.
Yeah. And now just, circling back all the way to, the traditional publishing again, it's, like the obviously, we say this all the time, what the publisher, what they're about, what their preferences are, or whatever. Like, we can't necessarily, you know, just because we're publishers doesn't mean we have an ESP connection with all the other publishers that exist, so we can't tell you necessarily what they're all gonna want or whatever. But some publishers out there, like they specifically state in their guidelines, must be previously, have X number of previous publications, before you consider submitting a manuscript there. I mean, you don't see that as much anymore. It still does exist. And, other ones, maybe they don't even take, manuscripts from somebody unless they've been published already in other projects that they've done. Because, publishers, they like the familiarity. So if they have a magazine, a journal, or anthologies or something, maybe they actually have like an internal requirement where it's like you need to have been published in X number of their publications, in with shorter pieces before they'll consider taking on your book. That's possible too. And and then there's publishers that just, they don't necessarily care about the previous publication, they just care about the content. So coming back to kind of like we always say, it depends. So we'd pretty much just given the general guidelines of, what might be good depending on your situation. So having a bunch of poems published before you go for the collection, it's not going to hurt you, can definitely help you in a lot of cases, would be a recommended thing to do. But it's not necessarily a requirement, and there is also no necessarily magic number that it's going to be like, well, we wanted at least 7, they've only got 6, so we're not going to consider them at all. I mean, again, there might be a few publishers out there who have that, but generally speaking, yeah.
Even the ones that have that it's more of a suggestion than a hard and fast rule. It's sort of like when you go to apply for a job and it says entry level requirements, 5 years experience. Yeah. Most of the time that 5 years experience really means like we want you to know what you're doing. And so even the publishers that do say you must have had X number of poems published before, a lot of times that shouldn't be a thing that stops you from submitting to them if they're a good fit for your work and you really want to go there. Because most of the times, if you're a good fit, they're willing to overlook those sorts of requirements.
Yeah, with the right set of circumstances, what their requirements will change.
Yeah.
So, well, I think that's about as many different ways that we can answer this question. So hopefully we did. Thank you all for listening. If you want free poetry prompts, just look down in the description of this video for that. Also publishing coaching options are there. Make sure to join the email list to get updates about seminars and talks and all other things we do. Again, this was the Publisher Speakeasy. Shh, don't tell anyone, and we will see you next time.
Bye, everybody.